There is a room on Terra that no one speaks of, buried 3 kilometers beneath the Palatine district, where the walls are lined with lead and psychically null-forged ceramite. Inside this room, which has no official designation in any Imperial archive, sits a single chair. Every soul-bound astropath who has served more than 30 years and retained enough sanity to speak coherently is eventually brought to this room. They are asked one question, and one question only. What did you see when he touched you? Not a single astropath, in 10,000 years of records stored in data vaults that officially do not exist, has ever given the same answer. Not one has ever said they saw the Emperor. My name is Cassian Vex, Inquisitor Emeritus of the Ordo Hereticus, and I have spent the last 40 years of my life reading those transcripts, cross-referencing those testimonies, and pursuing the single most forbidden line of inquiry in the Imperium. What if soul binding is not a blessing at all, but something far more terrible, a severance, a violation, a psychic lobotomy that transforms human beings into living relays for a signal they can never truly comprehend? I believed, as we all believe, because belief is the only alternative to madness in the 41st millennium. The official doctrine of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica is elegant in its simplicity and comforting in its divine symmetry. Every child raised in the Imperium learns the catechism of the Astropath from the moment they can comprehend language. The psyker is both blessed and cursed. The primers teach us from our earliest days in the Scala Progenium, their words branded into our minds alongside the litanies of hate and the prayers of protection. Blessed with the touch of the warp, cursed with its attention. But the Emperor, in his infinite mercy and boundless compassion, transforms curse into blessing through the sacred ritual of soul binding. The narrative flows with the cadence of liturgy, repeated so often across so many worlds that it has achieved the status of unquestionable truth. It is simple. It is elegant. It is necessary. And it has sustained itself across 10 millennia without significant variation, a monument to doctrinal consistency in an Imperium where so much else changes, corrupts, or crumbles into dust. Psychers manifest their abilities in childhood or adolescence, their minds suddenly opening to the roiling chaos of the immaterium like wounds cut into the fabric of reality itself. They are drawn to the Emperor's light like moths to a flame, their psychic signatures blazing bright enough for the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's instruments to detect across vast distances. The black ships travel ceaselessly across the galaxy, their holds designed to contain and suppress psychic emanations, collecting these manifested souls from 1,000,000 worlds and bringing them on the long, dark journey to Terra for judgment and purpose. This collection is presented not as imprisonment, but as salvation, a rescue of dangerous individuals who would otherwise become gateways for demonic incursion, and a gathering of precious resources that the Imperium desperately needs for its continued survival. The journey to Terra aboard the black ships is described in Imperial texts as a pilgrimage, a sacred passage from the isolated darkness of provincial worlds to the very heart of humanity's divine empire. The reality, which anyone who has witnessed the conditions aboard these vessels knows but rarely speaks of, is considerably grimmer. Psychers are kept in suppression cells, their abilities dampened by psychic null fields and pharmacological cocktails that leave them in a state of semi-consciousness for weeks or months at a time. Many die during transit, their bodies unable to withstand the strain of constant psychic suppression or their minds fragmenting under the isolation. Others go mad, their screams echoing through the holds until the ship's crew is forced to grant them the Emperor's peace simply to maintain order. But those who survive arrive at Terra with their psychic gifts intact, ready to be tested, categorized, and assigned to whatever purpose the Imperium deems most suitable. The testing process is thorough and unforgiving. Each psyker is subjected to a battery of examinations designed to measure the strength, stability, and nature of their psychic abilities. The assignment scale, developed in the earliest days of the Imperium and refined over millennia, categorizes psychers from alpha grade, the weakest, barely capable of minor telekinetic effects or surface-level telepathy, all the way to zeta grade and beyond. Those who register as too weak are culled immediately, for weak psychers are vulnerabilities that chaos can exploit without providing sufficient utility to justify the risk. A weak psycher might still become a gateway for demonic possession, but would never possess enough power to serve the Imperium effectively. Better to execute them and recycle their bodies for promethium than to allow such liabilities to exist. Those who register beyond zeta grade, whose psychic abilities burn so bright that they threaten to tear open the warp simply by existing, are reserved for other purposes. These purposes are never fully explained in public doctrine, though rumors persist across the Imperium of the Emperor's need for psychic fuel, of the 1,000 souls sacrificed daily to sustain the Golden Throne and the Astronomicon, of the vast pyres of psyker flesh that burn eternally in the deepest chambers beneath the Imperial Palace. Whether these rumors are true or mere Imperial propaganda designed to frighten potential heretics, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say, that the most powerful psychers who arrive on Terra are never seen again, and the Astronomicon continues to burn. And then there are those in the middle range, those with sufficient power to be useful, but not so much power that they cannot be controlled. These are the ones destined for soul binding, the ones who will become Astropaths if they survive the ritual. They represent perhaps 20% of all psychers brought to Terra, significant enough to maintain the vast network of psychic communication the Imperium requires, small enough that the Adeptus Astra Telepathica must constantly scour the galaxy for new candidates to replace those who die, go mad, or simply wear out under the strain of decades of service. The ritual of soul binding itself is shrouded in mysticism and reverence. The official accounts describe it in language that borders on the ecstatic, transforming a psychic procedure into a moment of divine transcendence. The psyker, having survived the journey to Terra and passed all tests of worthiness, is brought to the Imperial Palace, that vast edifice of gold and adamantium that has stood for 10,000 years as the center of human civilization. They are led through corridors where Primarchs once walked, past chambers where the great decisions of the Great Crusade were made, deeper and deeper into the heart of the palace, until they reach the throne room itself. The throne room of the Emperor is described in every piece of imperial literature as the most sacred space in the entire galaxy, a place where the divine and material realms intersect, where the master of mankind sits in eternal vigil, maintaining the Astronomicon that guides all of humanity's ships through the treacherous tides of the warp. The Golden Throne itself is said to be a marvel of Dark Age technology combined with the Emperor's own psychic might, a device that allows him to project his consciousness across the entire galaxy while his broken body remains seated upon Terra. For 10,000 years he has sat thus ever since the traitor Horus struck him down in the final moments of the heresy, his sacrifice sustaining the Imperium even as his physical form slowly withers. The psyker kneels before this throne. They pray, speaking words that have been taught to them during their preparation, entreaties for the Emperor's blessing and promises of eternal service. And then, according to every official account, every sermon preached from 10,000 pulpits, every instruction manual produced by the Scholastica Sacana, the Emperor himself reaches out through the warp and touches their soul directly. This moment of contact is described as simultaneously the most terrifying and most beautiful experience a human being can endure. The Emperor's consciousness, vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond reckoning, powerful beyond measure, makes contact with the fragile, limited awareness of a single human psyker. What happens in that moment of contact is described differently by every astropath who speaks of it, and this variation is presented as evidence of the deeply personal nature of divine communion. The Emperor, we are told, appears to each supplicant according to their own nature and understanding, revealing himself in whatever form their mind can best comprehend without shattering under the weight of his divinity. Some report seeing a figure of golden light, radiant with power that makes the sun seem dim by comparison, his features simultaneously clear and indistinct, familiar yet alien, human yet transcendent. Others describe hearing a voice of infinite compassion speaking their true name, the name that exists not merely in imperial records, but in the deeper reality of the warp, the name their soul has carried since before they were born. Still others report simply feeling an overwhelming presence, a consciousness so vast and ancient that their own mind seems like a candle flame before a star, insignificant yet acknowledged, small yet seen. The specific details vary wildly from one astropath to another, but the overall narrative remains absolutely consistent across 10,000 years and millions of individual accounts. The Emperor sees them, knows them, judges them worthy, and transforms them. His divine touch burns away the impurities of their psychic nature, all the vulnerabilities and weaknesses that make unsanctioned psychers such dangerous liabilities. He seals the cracks in their soul through which daemons might enter, fortifying their psychic defenses with a portion of his own infinite power. And he forges a permanent connection between the astropath and the astronomicon, that great psychic beacon that shines from Terra across the entire galaxy, creating a link that will guide them for the rest of their lives no matter where in the Imperium they might be stationed. This connection serves two sacred purposes, both essential to the astropath's function. First, it protects them from the predations of the warp. An astropath is not merely a psyker with training and discipline. They are linked directly to the Emperor's own power, and any daemon that attempts to possess them must face his wrath directly. This protection is not absolute. No defense against chaos can ever be truly perfect, but it is formidable enough that astropaths can navigate the warp with considerably less risk than unsanctioned psychers face. Second, it empowers them, granting them the ability to project their thoughts across vast distances of real space by riding the psychic currents of the warp, always guided by the astronomicon's light. Without this connection, astropathic communication would be impossible. With it, messages can be sent from one side of the galaxy to the other, albeit with significant effort and cost. The price, as all imperial citizens are taught from childhood, is steep but acceptable. The intensity of the Emperor's divine radiance is simply too great for mortal eyes to withstand, and so approximately 3/4 of all astropaths are blinded during the soul-binding ritual. Their eyes burn away in the moment of contact, consumed by holy fire, leaving empty sockets that mark them forever as those who have gazed upon the face of God and survived. But this blindness is presented not as a tragedy or a disability, but as a sacred mark, proof that they have been touched by the Emperor's own hand. The blind astropath is honored in imperial society, feared perhaps for their psychic abilities and their connection to the unknowable warp, but also respected as living saints of communication, their sacrifice visible and undeniable. Some psychers do not survive the ritual at all. The official statistics, carefully maintained by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and published in administrative records that few citizens ever read and fewer still understand, indicate that approximately 30% of psychers brought before the Golden Throne for soul-binding die in the attempt. Their souls are too weak to withstand the Emperor's touch, we are told, or their faith is insufficient to sustain them through the transformation, or they harbor some hidden corruption that is burned away along with their life. These deaths are presented as merciful necessities, as the Emperor's own judgment separating the worthy from the unworthy. Better to die in his divine presence, their souls consumed by holy fire than to live as potential vectors for chaos corruption. Better to have one's existence ended by the master of mankind than to become a gateway through which demons might pour into the material realm and corrupt others. Those who survive the soul binding and retain their sanity, approximately 70% of those who undergo the ritual, or about 14% of all psychers initially collected by the black ships, emerge transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. They are blind, yes, but they see in other ways, perceiving the psychic resonances of living beings, the emotional currents that flow through crowds like invisible tides, the subtle distortions in reality that indicate warp presence or demonic influence. They are marked, their psychic signature forever altered, recognizable to other psychers and to trained observers as one who has stood before the golden throne and been judged worthy of service. And they are bound, connected to the Astronomicon in a way that provides constant orientation, a psychic compass that always points toward Terra, no matter where in the galaxy they might be stationed, no matter how chaotic the warp currents become. The life of an astropath after soul binding is presented in imperial doctrine as one of honored service and sacred duty. They are stationed across the Imperium, on every major world, every significant naval vessel, every military installation and administrative facility that requires connection to the broader network of imperial communication. They live in astropathic sanctuaries, specially constructed buildings that serve as both monastery and fortress, their thick walls lined with psychically resonant materials and their deepest chambers protected by null field generators. These sanctuaries are described in official literature as places of peace and contemplation, holy sites where astropaths meditate on the Emperor's glory and prepare themselves mentally and spiritually for the sacred task of transmission. The reality, which anyone who has spent time observing astropathic sanctuaries knows but rarely discusses openly, is more complicated. The sanctuaries are indeed places of contemplation, but not necessarily peaceful ones. Astropaths require isolation from normal human consciousness because the constant psychic noise of populated areas interferes with their ability to achieve the trance states necessary for long-range transmission. They live largely apart from ordinary imperial citizens, their days structured around meditation, psychic exercises, and the actual work of sending and receiving messages. Many develop peculiar habits and obsessions, spending hours arranging objects in patterns that have psychic significance, speaking to entities that no one else can perceive, or simply sitting in perfect silence while their consciousness ranges across the galaxy. When a message must be sent, the process is described in terms that emphasize both the difficulty and the nobility of the task. The astropath receives the message from whoever requires transmission, a Lord Commander issuing orders to distant fleets, an Inquisitor coordinating investigations across multiple sectors, a planetary governor requesting reinforcements from neighboring systems, a merchant consortium arranging trade agreements across light years of space. They memorize the message or encode it into a format suitable for psychic transmission, then enter a trance state that allows their consciousness to expand beyond their physical body. This expansion is not metaphorical. The astropath's awareness literally leaves their flesh behind, projecting into the warp itself, that roiling sea of psychic energy and emotional resonance where the laws of physics hold no sway and time itself becomes fluid and uncertain. There they encounter raw chaos, the infinite possibility and infinite danger of the immaterium, where thoughts become tangible and emotions have the weight of physical force. Predators hunt in the warp, entities of pure psychic energy that hunger for the taste of mortal consciousness. Currents of raw emotion sweep across vast distances, carrying the psychic echoes of fear, hatred, joy, despair from billions of souls across the galaxy. And through it all, The warp itself writhes and shifts, its very nature unstable and hostile to material beings. Without the Astronomicon, this journey would be impossible. The warp offers no landmarks, no stable reference points by which to navigate, nothing but chaos and hunger, and the whispers of things that should not exist. But the Astronomicon shines like a lighthouse in a storm, a psychic beacon of such incredible power that it can be perceived from anywhere in the galaxy. The Astropath uses it to orient themselves, to find their position in the great psychic geography of the cosmos, to plot a course through the chaos to wherever their message must be sent. Then comes the transmission itself. The Astropath takes the message they have been given and transforms it from language into pure psychic impulse, encoding information into patterns of thought and emotion that can travel through the warp. This is not simple telepathy, not the direct mind-to-mind contact that some lesser psychers can achieve across short distances with people they know personally. This is something far more complex and demanding, a sophisticated encoding of information into psychic structures that can survive the distortions and predations of the warp, traveling across light years or even across the entire galaxy, and arrive at their destination intact enough to be decoded by another astropath. The message is not sent to a specific individual. It is broadcast across the warp, and any astropath whose consciousness is attuned to the correct psychic frequency can receive it. This creates inherent security risks. Messages can be intercepted by enemy astropaths or even by warp entities capable of understanding human thought, but also provides redundancy, ensuring that messages reach their destinations even if individual astropaths are killed or incapacitated. The sender projects the encoded message into the warp, where it ripples outward like a stone cast into a pond, gradually dispersing as it travels until it is either received by an astropath tuned to the correct frequency or dissipates entirely into the background chaos of the Imperium. The strain of this process is acknowledged in imperial doctrine, but presented as sacred suffering, as martyrdom in service to the Emperor's will, as the price that must be paid for the Imperium's continued survival. Astropaths who perform transmissions regularly experience severe migraines that can last for days after a particularly difficult sending. They suffer frequent nosebleeds as psychic pressure builds within their skulls, sometimes so severe that they must be hospitalized for blood loss. They experience episodes of temporary disorientation where they lose track of whether they are in their physical body or still ranging through the warp, sometimes resulting in injuries as they walk into walls or fall down stairs because they cannot properly perceive their material surroundings, and they endure periods of catatonia, their consciousness remaining partially trapped in the warp even after their body has returned to the material realm, leaving them unresponsive for hours or days at a time. Prolonged service leads to cumulative damage that is permanent and progressive. The brain tissue that allows psychic abilities to function begins to degrade under constant stress, showing patterns of neural scarring and cellular death that can be measured with medical equipment. The astropath's psychic signature becomes increasingly unstable, fluctuating wildly instead of maintaining steady patterns, making them more susceptible to warp phenomena and daemonic attention. Their connection to the Astronomicon, that vital link forged during soul binding, begins to fray and weaken, like a rope under constant tension, gradually separating fiber by fiber until it finally snaps. Most astropaths serve for 20 to 30 years before the accumulated strain renders them unable to perform their duties reliably. Some last longer, their natural resilience, or the particular nature of their psychic gift, allowing them to endure what others cannot. The record, according to official documentation, is held by an astropath named Cordelius of Macragge, who served for 83 years before finally succumbing to psychic exhaustion. But these exceptional cases are rare. The average service life is 26.4 years, a statistic maintained with perfect precision across millennia. Another number that should vary based on individual circumstances, but somehow remains constant. What happens to these worn-out astropaths is described vaguely and euphemistically in official doctrine. They are retired with honor, granted the Emperor's peace, allowed to live out their remaining years in contemplation and prayer. The language suggests a gentle transition to a comfortable retirement, perhaps in some monastery or rest facility where they can recover from their service and enjoy whatever peace is possible for those who have stared into the warp for decades. The reality, which I would discover much later in my investigation through means I will detail shortly, is considerably different and far more disturbing. For 143 years, I believed this doctrine with the absolute certainty of the faithful. I had joined the Inquisition as a young man, barely 20 standard years old, filled with zeal and conviction that the Emperor protected, and that service to his Imperium was the highest calling a human being could achieve. I had trained for decades, learning to identify heresy in all its forms, studying the manifestations of chaos corruption, memorizing the 1,000 signs that indicated demonic presence or psychic contamination. I had overseen the purging of corrupted psyker covens, interrogated rogue astropaths who had fallen to chaos, witnessed the madness that comes to those who touch the warp without the Emperor's protection. The doctrine made perfect sense to me. It fit the world I saw. Psykers were dangerous but necessary. Soul-binding transformed them from liabilities into assets. The Emperor's divine touch protected them even as it demanded their service and sacrifice. And if some died in the ritual or went mad from the strain of decades of transmission, well, that was the price of survival in a hostile galaxy. Better a controlled, sanctified expenditure of psykers in service to the Imperium than allowing them to exist unsupervised where they might become gateways for demonic incursion. I had personally overseen at least 24 investigations into Astropathic Sanctuaries over the course of my career. Incidents of mass psychic disturbance, individual astropaths displaying signs of corruption or instability, reports of unauthorized transmissions or communications with unknown entities. These were the kinds of cases that fell to the Ordo Hereticus. In every single investigation, I found explanations that fit comfortably within the framework of imperial doctrine. A tainted artifact brought into the sanctuary by an unwitting servant, creating psychic disturbances that affected the astropaths. A weak point in the sanctuary's psychic shielding, allowing warp entities to exert subtle influence on those within. An astropath whose faith had wavered, creating an opening for possession or corruption. The solutions were always the same. Purge the corrupted elements, strengthen the defenses, remind the surviving astropaths of their sacred duty and the Emperor's eternal vigilance. Gol Tertius should have been another such investigation. Just another routine response to a reported psychic disturbance. The kind of incident that occurred perhaps once or twice a year across my assigned subsector. Nothing particularly unusual or alarming. The initial reports were concerning, but not unprecedented. All astropaths in the primary sanctuary had simultaneously ceased normal operations and were displaying signs of coordinated psychic activity. Coordinated psychic activity among astropaths is not inherently suspicious. They often work in choirs, combining their abilities to send particularly important or complex messages across greater distances than any individual could achieve alone. But this coordination had not been ordered by the sanctuary's overseers, had not followed any established protocol, and had begun spontaneously during what should have been a period of rest and meditation. I arrived on Gol Tertius 17 days after the initial incident, traveling aboard an inquisitorial frigate with a retinue that included Carvus, my sanctioned psyker, and trusted advisor of 30 years, 3 combat servitors modified for psychic threat response. and a squad of stormtroopers from the Tempestus Scions who had been trained specifically in dealing with possessed or corrupted psychers. The planetary governor met me at the primary landing platform, his anxiety evident in every gesture and word, despite his attempts to maintain proper imperial decorum. The Astropathic Sanctuary was vital to the planet's ability to communicate with the broader Imperium. He explained as we traveled toward the facility, and its malfunction threatened to isolate Gol Tertius at a time when isolation could prove fatal. The subsector was experiencing increased orc raids, and without the ability to call for reinforcements or coordinate with neighboring systems, the planet was vulnerable to being overrun. The sanctuary itself was built in the style common to such facilities across the Imperium, a fortress of gray stone and reinforced ferrocrete, its walls thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment, its foundations sunk deep into bedrock to provide stability both physical and psychic. Psychic dampening fields were woven into the very structure, resonant materials embedded in the walls to absorb and redirect warp energies. The deepest sublevels contained null zones where astropaths could retreat if they needed absolute isolation from psychic phenomena, rooms so thoroughly shielded that not even the Astronomican's light could penetrate. The exterior showed no signs of damage or assault. The guards at the gate reported no unusual activity in the weeks preceding the incident, no unauthorized visitors, no deliveries that might have contained tainted artifacts. Everything appeared normal, orderly, exactly as it should be, until I entered the transmission chambers where the Astropaths performed their sacred duty. 217 Astropaths had been stationed at the Gol Tertius Sanctuary, a significant choir by the standards of a frontier world, but not unusually large. When I stepped through the threshold of the primary transmission hall, all 217 were present, arranged in perfect concentric circles around a central focus point, their eyeless faces turned toward the same cardinal direction with uncanny precision. They were not moving, not speaking, not transmitting in any conventional sense that my instruments could detect, but the air itself seemed to vibrate with psychic pressure, a sensation like standing too close to a massive generator or walking beneath high-voltage power lines, something invisible making itself felt through purely physical sensations. Carvis stopped at the threshold of the chamber and refused to enter despite my direct order to accompany me. In 3 decades of service together, he had never once disobeyed me, had followed me into daemon-haunted ruins and chaos-corrupted hive cities without hesitation. But now he stood rigid at the doorway, his face pale, his hands trembling, blood beginning to trickle from his nose, even though he was merely standing near the chamber, rather than entering it. "It's not chaos," he said, his voice tight with something I had never heard from him before, not fear exactly, but a kind of profound confusion, as if he were perceiving something that violated everything he understood about psychic phenomena. "It's not possession. It's not any of the standard manifestations of warp corruption. The psychic signature is wrong, all wrong, but it's not wrong in any way I've been trained to recognize. It's not evil. It's not malevolent, but it's so deeply, fundamentally wrong that I can't even find words to describe how wrong it is. Please don't ask me to go in there. I don't think I would survive it." I had never seen Carvis so close to panic. He was a beta-grade psyker, strong enough to be useful, but stable enough to be trusted, sanctioned and soul-bound, and utterly reliable. If whatever was happening in that chamber could reduce him to this state simply through proximity, then I needed to understand it. I ordered him to remain at the threshold and maintain psychic monitoring from a safe distance, then activated my personal null field generator, a rare and precious piece of inquisitorial equipment that projected a small sphere of psychic dead space around me and advanced into the chamber alone. The Astropaths did not acknowledge my presence as I walked among them. They simply sat in their circles, their faces turned toward galactic north, their lips moving soundlessly in what might have been prayer, or might have been something else entirely. Their psychic signatures, which I could perceive through specialized equipment even with my null field active, were perfectly synchronized, pulsing in exact unison like the beating of a single vast heart. The tech priests who maintained the sanctuary's monitoring equipment had set up their instruments around the perimeter of the chamber, and the senior magos approached me with data slates, displaying readings that made no sense according to standard psychic theory. The Astropaths are receiving, not transmitting, he explained, his mechadendrites twitching with an agitation that suggested genuine distress rather than mere mechanical response. The Adeptus Mechanicus are not given to emotional displays, but this one seemed barely able to contain his confusion. The psychic energy flowing into this chamber is immense, orders of magnitude beyond what any individual astropath should be capable of processing without immediate neural destruction. Yet they are not being overwhelmed, not being destroyed by the input. They are simply receiving, absorbing, processing, and the source of the transmission. He paused, his biological eye widening slightly while his augmetic lens clicked and refocused. The source is not any known Astropathic Sanctuary in the Imperium. We have triangulated the origin point based on the directional focus of their attention and the characteristics of the psychic signature. The signal is coming from Terra itself, from the Imperial Palace, from the Golden Throne, Terra, the throne world, the heart of the Imperium, the seat of the Emperor himself. A transmission from Terra was not unusual in itself. Commands from the High Lords, directives from the Adeptus Administratum, orders from the Inquisitorial Conclave, pronouncements from the Ecclesiarchy. But those transmissions followed established protocols, were sent through official channels, were received by designated astropaths who then transcribed and delivered the messages to appropriate authorities through proper chains of command. This was something else entirely. This was a signal of such overwhelming power that every single astropath in the sanctuary had been compelled to receive it simultaneously, abandoning all other duties, all other awareness, all other functions, focusing the absolute totality of their psychic ability on this single reception. Have you been able to decode the message? I asked the Magos, though I suspected I already knew the answer. He made a gesture with his remaining human hand that I interpreted as negation combined with uncertainty. The message is not in any standard astropathic code. It does not follow the psychic encoding protocols established by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. It does not conform to any known format for imperial communications. In fact, we are not certain it is a message in the conventional sense at all. It may be something else, a signal, a pulse, a resonance, or perhaps simply noise. Psychic static amplified to such intensity that every astropath within range is forced to receive it whether they will or no. I spent 6 hours in that chamber, observing the astropaths with growing unease, reviewing the technical data that made less sense the more I examined it, consulting with Carvus about the psychic signatures he could detect from his position outside the chamber. The astropaths remained motionless throughout, their synchronization perfect, their attention utterly focused on whatever they were receiving from Terra. And then, without warning, without any change in the instrument readings or shift in the psychic pressure filling the room, they began to scream. Not individually, not in sequence, but all at once. 217 voices rising in perfect synchronization to produce a sound that was almost harmonic, almost musical in its terrible unity. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, inscribing itself directly into my consciousness, despite the null field generator I carried. They screamed in a language I did not recognize, syllables that seemed to have physical weight, that pressed against my mind like fingers probing for weakness. Carvus collapsed at the threshold, blood streaming from his nose and ears and eyes. the tech priest's instruments overloaded in sequence, several exploding in showers of sparks and molten metal, their machine spirits shrieking in binary before falling silent. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The Astropaths slumped in their positions, some unconscious, others merely catatonic, their perfect synchronization shattered. The psychic pressure that had filled the chamber dissipated like smoke in a strong wind, leaving behind only normal baseline warp resonance. In the silence that followed, broken only by the crackling of damaged machinery and Carvus's labored breathing, I felt something I had not felt in decades of service to the Inquisition. Genuine uncertainty about the nature of what I had just witnessed. The aftermath was chaotic but manageable according to established protocols. Most of the Astropaths recovered within hours, though none retained any conscious memory of the incident or the message they had received. They remembered entering meditation, remembered beginning their routine psychic exercises, and then nothing until they woke to find Medicae attending to them and inquisitorial personnel securing the sanctuary. Medical scans showed evidence of significant psychic strain, neural scarring consistent with severe warp exposure, temporary disruption of their connection to the Astronomicon, elevated stress hormones and neurotransmitter imbalances, but nothing that indicated permanent damage or corruption. 17 Astropaths did not recover. They remained catatonic despite all efforts to rouse them, their minds apparently locked in some psychic fugue state from which they could not be retrieved. The Medica could detect brain activity, could confirm that their consciousness still existed somewhere, but could not reach them or bring them back to awareness of the material world. They were transferred to specialized facilities for long-term care, their prognosis uncertain. 3 others awoke long enough to realize what had happened to them and immediately found ways to end their lives, despite being under constant observation and medical care. 1 tore open their own throat with their fingernails, moving with such speed and determination that the guards could not restrain them in time. Another somehow stopped their own heart through sheer force of psychic will, causing a cardiac arrest that killed them before emergency medical intervention could be administered. The 3rd simply refused to breathe, holding their breath until they asphyxiated, and when the Medica tried to intubate them to force air into their lungs, the Astropath triggered a massive psychic backlash that killed everyone in the medical bay and left their own body too damaged to resuscitate. The official explanation was drafted by representatives of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica within a week of my initial report: a localized warp anomaly, possibly related to the increased orc presence in the sub-sector, creating psychic turbulence through the sheer weight of their collective unconscious, had created temporary distortions in the psychic field surrounding Gol Tertius. The Astropaths, being extraordinarily sensitive to such phenomena, had reflexively attempted to compensate for the distortion, resulting in synchronized psychic activity that appeared alarming to observers, but was ultimately harmless. The 17 catatonic Astropaths were suffering from psychic exhaustion and would be transported to specialized facilities where they would receive the best care available until they recovered. The 3 suicides were tragic, but understood some minds are simply too fragile to withstand even brief exposure to concentrated warp phenomena, and the Emperor, in his mercy, had granted them release from suffering they could not otherwise endure. I should have accepted this explanation. Every instinct trained into me over more than a century of service told me to accept it, file my report, and move on to the next investigation. The explanation was plausible, fit within established parameters of psychic phenomena, and had been endorsed by the highest authorities of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. But something about the incident refused to settle into comfortable certainty. The perfect synchronization of the Astropath's scream kept echoing in my mind. The fact that Carvus, one of the most experienced and stable sanctioned psychers I had ever known, had been overwhelmed by merely proximity to whatever was happening in that chamber. The Magos's insistence that the signal had originated from Terra itself, from the direction of the Imperial Palace, from the location of the Golden Throne. And then, 23 days after the incident, as I was preparing to leave Gol Tertius and return to my regular duties, I received an astropathic message that changed everything. It came not through official channels, but burned directly into my mind during a moment of rest, the kind of emergency transmission that astropaths are trained to use only in the most dire circumstances, when normal communication protocols have broken down entirely. The psychic impact was so intense that it knocked me unconscious, my body convulsing as the message carved itself into my consciousness with a force that felt like physical violence. When I woke hours later, I found that my personal cogitator had recorded 5 words in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing them, and my hand was cramped as though I had been gripping the stylus with crushing force. 5 words, repeated over and over again across 3 data slates, filling page after page with the same desperate message. It was never the Emperor. The transmission had come from Valdis, a choir master who had served at the Gol Tertius Sanctuary for 46 years. He had been one of the 3 who took their own lives in the aftermath of the incident, the one who had stopped his own heart through psychic will. Except the timing was impossible. The message had been sent 2 days after his death, after his body had been cremated and his ashes scattered according to astropathic tradition. Either the Medici had made a catastrophic error in pronouncing him dead, or he had somehow managed to send one final transmission in the moment of his death, or something else entirely was happening that I did not yet understand. I spent 3 days attempting to trace the source of the transmission, using every investigative technique I had learned over more than a century of service. I interrogated the sanctuary staff, reviewed medical records, examined the crematorium logs, consulted with tech priests about whether a psychic echo could persist after physical death. Every avenue of investigation led to the same impossible conclusion: Valdis was definitely dead, had definitely been dead for 2 days before the message was sent, and yet the message had definitely come from his psychic signature, encoded with his personal identification markers that no other astropath could replicate. That was the anomaly. That was the crack in the monolithic certainty of Imperial doctrine. 5 words sent by a dead man, words that suggested everything I believed about the nature of soul binding might be incomplete, distorted, or fundamentally false. It was never the Emperor. Not, "The Emperor has abandoned us," or "The Emperor is false," or any of the standard heresies that chaos corruption produces. Simply the suggestion that whatever touches psychers during soul binding, whatever creates the astropaths and binds them to their service, is not what we have been told it is. I should have reported the message immediately to my superiors in the Ordo Hereticus. I should have flagged it as potential evidence of chaos corruption, recommended that all astropaths from the Gol Tertius Sanctuary undergo additional screening, and closed the investigation. But instead, I did something that I had never done in 143 years of faithful service. I concealed evidence. I deleted the message from my cogitator, burned the data slates, and told no one what I had received. And then I began to investigate in earnest, not as an inquisitor pursuing heresy, but as a seeker of truth pursuing forbidden knowledge. That was 40 years ago. 40 years of carefully concealed research, of following leads that I documented nowhere except in encrypted personal records, of asking questions that attracted increasingly worried attention from my colleagues and superiors. 40 years of assembling fragments of evidence that, taken individually, might be dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation, but taken together formed a pattern so disturbing that I could not unsee it once I recognized what I was looking at. The first fragment of real evidence came from what should have been a routine interrogation. I had captured a Chaos Space Marine of the Thousand Suns during the Orpheus incursion in M39, a sorcerer whose war band had been attempting to steal an artifact from an Imperial temple world. The capture itself was unremarkable, a standard military operation. My stormtroopers supported by elements of the Astra Militarum, the traitor isolated and subdued through coordinated fire. But the interrogation that followed yielded information that I have never reported to anyone. The sorcerer was held in an inquisitorial black site for 3 years, while I worked to break through his psychic defenses. 3 years of careful psychic conditioning, pharmacological intervention, sensory deprivation, and the application of sophisticated torture techniques designed not merely to cause pain, but to create psychological states where resistance becomes impossible. The Thousand Suns are notoriously difficult to interrogate. Their minds are protected by sorceress wards, their personalities fragmented across multiple layers of psychic defense, their loyalty to their Primarch Magnus reinforced by 10,000 years of bitter devotion. But eventually, inevitably, the defenses crumble. Everyone breaks eventually. It is simply a matter of finding the correct pressure to apply. When he finally began to speak, the sorcerer did not rave about the glories of chaos or promise damnation to the false emperor. Instead, he spoke with a kind of wary clarity, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask him the right questions for millennia, and was almost relieved to finally answer. I asked him why the Thousand Suns had sought forbidden knowledge even before their fall to chaos, why they had violated the Emperor's edict against sorcery when they knew the consequences could be catastrophic. His answer has haunted me ever since. We sought to understand what was done to us, he said, his voice hoarse from Dessous but perfectly coherent. All of us, all the legions, all the Primarchs, we knew something was wrong. We could feel it in our very nature, the sense that we were not what we should be, that something essential had been taken from us or never given to us in the first place. But only Magnus was willing to look directly at the truth. Only he was willing to use the tools at his disposal to examine the very fabric of what we were. I pressed him for details, administering carefully calibrated doses of stimulants to keep him conscious and focused while his exhausted mind wanted nothing more than to retreat into oblivion. What had Magnus discovered? What truth had he seen that the other Primarchs could not or would not acknowledge? The Emperor's touch was not a gift, the sorcerer continued, and his voice carried a weight of bitter understanding that seemed impossible to fake. It was a chain. Every psyker who kneels before him is shackled, their potential truncated, their will subordinated to his great working. But the Astropaths, he laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. The Astropaths are the most thoroughly enslaved of all, for they are not merely chained but hollowed out, made into vessels for a purpose they cannot comprehend. Magnus saw this. He understood that what the Emperor called blessing was actually a form of psychic surgery so precise and so profound that its victims could not even recognize they had been violated. That is why he was punished, not because he broke the Nikaya edict, but because he saw what the Emperor had done and tried to warn the others. Could this testimony be trusted? Certainly not without corroboration. The testimony of traitors is always suspect, contaminated by chaos corruption and twisted by 10,000 years of serving the ruinous powers. The Thousand Suns, in particular, are known for their manipulation and deception, their ability to craft lies so sophisticated that they contain kernels of truth to make them believable. But here is what troubled me. What kept me from dismissing this testimony as mere heretical propaganda, if the sorcerer sought merely to spread lies and sow discord? Why would he frame the Emperor's actions in terms of pragmatic necessity rather than pure evil? He did not claim the Emperor was a daemon or a tyrant motivated by sadistic cruelty. He claimed the Emperor was a wielder of psychic engineering so sophisticated that even his own sons could not fully comprehend it, using that engineering to create tools suited for specific purposes. This is not the language of chaos propaganda. Chaos seeks to corrupt, to turn loyalty to hatred, to transform faith into despair. It would present the Emperor as monstrous, as worthy of betrayal and destruction. But this sorcerer presented the Emperor as something more disturbing than a monster, as an engineer working with human consciousness as his material, shaping and molding and optimizing without regard for the autonomy or dignity of his subjects, but also without malice or cruelty, simply doing what needed to be done to achieve the necessary result. I kept this testimony sealed in my private archives, encrypted with codes known only to me, documented nowhere in official reports. And I continued searching for other fragments that might corroborate or refute what the sorcerer had told me. The second fragment came from a source that I still find difficult to credit, even having verified its authenticity through every means at my disposal. Among the artifacts recovered from a destroyed craft world in the Cadian sector, this was before the fall of Cadia, during a period when the Imperium was still conducting offensive operations against the Elder rather than desperately defending against chaos. My agents discovered a soul stone that still contained the psychic imprint of a Farseer. The Elder used these stones to preserve their souls after death, protecting them from being consumed by she who thirsts. Normally such stones are inert to human psychic perception, their contents locked away behind xenos psychic barriers that we cannot breach. But this particular stone had been damaged during the craft world's destruction, its protective wards partially collapsed, leaving the psychic imprint within accessible to sufficiently skilled human psychers. I employed Carvus to extract fragments of memory from the stone, a dangerous and potentially heretical procedure that required him to partially merge his consciousness with that of a long-dead xenos. The Elder Farseer's memories were fragmentary and difficult to interpret, their thought patterns so alien to human consciousness that translation was approximate at best. But among those memories were observations of the Great Crusade, of the Emperor's early experiments with psychic manipulation, of events that occurred during the unification of Terra that the Eldar had witnessed from afar, with their characteristically detached interest in the affairs of lesser species. The Farseer's memories included detailed observations of what the Elder referred to in their own language as the sundering of the Troyer. The translation is imprecise carvets, that simply Gothic equivalents for concepts that simply do not exist in human language, but the essential meaning was clear. In approximately M30, shortly after the unification of Terra and before the launch of the Great Crusade, the Emperor conducted a series of experiments with human psychers, attempting to create a network of telepathic communication that could span the galaxy without requiring ships to travel through the warp to deliver messages physically. The first attempts failed catastrophically. The Farseer's memory contained psychic impressions of these failures, human psychers, whose minds simply exploded under the strain of attempting long-range communication, their skulls rupturing as neural tissue liquefied. Others went irrevocably mad, their consciousness fragmenting into thousands of separate identities that screamed different messages simultaneously. Still others were possessed by warp entities, attracted to their unshielded minds, becoming gateways through which daemons poured into the material realm before the Emperor's custodians could terminate them. The Farseer had watched these experiments with what Carvus described as a mixture of clinical fascination and something that might have been pity, though Elder emotions are difficult to translate into human terms. What struck the Farseer most profoundly was not the failures themselves, but the Emperor's response to them. He showed no grief at the deaths, no hesitation, no doubt. He simply observed the results, made notes using methods the Farseer could not fully perceive, adjusted his psychic parameters, and tried again, and again, and again, refining the technique with each iteration, eliminating failure modes, optimizing the process. The memory contained a phrase in the Elder tongue that Carvus translated as the forced blooming. The Farseer had watched as the Emperor human psychers, whose potential was still raw and unformed and subjected to a psychic process that simultaneously awakened their full telepathic abilities and abilities and crippled their capacity for their psychic expression. They became powerful. Yes, vastly more powerful than they had been before the procedure. But their power was channeled entirely into strictly defined parameters. They could send and receive astropathic messages with extraordinary clarity and range, but they could not perform any other form of psychic manifestation. It was as if their vast potential had been dammed and diverted to turn a single mill wheel. All that psychic energy flowing through one narrow channel instead of the infinite possibilities that unrestricted psychic development might have allowed. The Elder, who understands psychic manipulation in ways that humanity never will, who have been working with psychic phenomena since before humans developed language, recognized this immediately for what it was. Psychic surgery, performed without consent, designed to create tools rather than nurture individuals. The Farseer's memory included a thought that Carvus translated with some difficulty. He shapes them, as we once shaped the younger races. But where we sought to guide and develop, he seeks only to optimize and control. He is not a teacher but a craftsman, and the materials he works with do not realize they are being worked. Can we trust the testimony of xenos? The Elder are ancient, manipulative, and pursue their own inscrutable agendas. They view humanity as inferior, as children playing with forces we cannot understand, as a species that will inevitably destroy itself through our own hubris and ignorance. If they sought to turn humanity against the Emperor, if they wished to sow discord within the Imperium, they could easily craft false visions and plant them in soul stones for us to discover. But consider the strategic value of this information, or rather the lack thereof. If the Elder sought to turn humanity against the Emperor, if they wished to undermine the foundations of the imperial faith, they would present him as a monster, as a force of pure malevolence, as something worthy of hatred and rebellion. Instead, they present him as a craftsman working with psychic materials, shaping and molding human potential to achieve necessary functions. This is not propaganda designed to inspire rebellion. This is observation, clinical and detached, the kind of analysis that a superior intellect performs when studying inferior species. The Elder do not need us to rebel against the Emperor. They do not benefit from our internal discord. If anything, a strong and unified Imperium serves their interests by providing a buffer against chaos and other threats. So why would they fabricate evidence of the Emperor's psychic engineering? Unless it was simply true, simply what they observed, simply data that they recorded, because recording data is what Farseers do. I kept this evidence sealed alongside the sorcerer's testimony, two fragments that seemed to corroborate each other, despite coming from entirely different sources with entirely different motivations. And I continued searching. The third fragment came from the most dangerous source imaginable. Pre-imperial archives hidden beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra itself. Gaining access to these archives required resources that I barely possessed, even as an Inquisitor, connections that took me decades to cultivate, and a willingness to commit what could only be described as archaeological heresy. The chambers beneath the Himalayan mountains contain remnants of the dark age of technology, artifacts and records from before Old Night, before the Age of Strife, before the Emperor revealed himself to humanity and began his great work of unification. These chambers are sealed by order of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who claim exclusive rights to all archeotech and who guard such sites with religious fervor. Entering them without proper authorization is heresy against the machine god, punishable by immediate execution. But I had spent 30 years building relationships with a particular rogue trader whose business interests occasionally required him to acquire items that existed in legal gray areas, and whose loyalty could be purchased not with thrones, but with information valuable to his commercial operations. He arranged passage for me and a small team through routes that did not officially exist, using access codes that had been stolen from Mechanicus archives centuries ago and carefully preserved by those who found them useful. We spent 6 days in those ancient chambers, working with portable cogitators and auspex scanners to locate and retrieve data crystals that might contain relevant information. The radiation levels were lethal without proper shielding, and we lost 2 of my team to equipment failures before we even found what we were looking for. But eventually, buried in a vault that had not been opened in at least 10,000 years, we discovered data crystals of a type that had not been manufactured since the dark age of technology. Crystals that still contained fragmentary records of experiments conducted by the being who would become the Emperor. The records were incomplete, corrupted by time and radiation, vast sections of data degraded beyond recovery. But what remained was enough to fundamentally alter my understanding of what soul binding actually represents. The Emperor, or the being who would become the Emperor. For these records predated the Imperium, and even the Unification Wars had conducted extensive research into the nature of human consciousness and the mechanisms by which psychic potential could be controlled, modified, and optimized for specific purposes. One series of experiments involved the creation of what the ancient records called psychic resonance templates, patterns of neural and psychic activity that could be imposed upon a human mind through direct psychic contact. The records described the process in technical language that I struggled to fully comprehend, even with the assistance of the team's most knowledgeable tech priest. The subject's consciousness would be analyzed, their psychic architecture mapped in extraordinary detail, and then a pre-designed template would be imposed upon that architecture through a process the records called harmonic synchronization. The subject would retain their memories, their personality, their sense of continuous identity. They would still be themselves in every way they could consciously measure, but their underlying psychic structure would be restructured according to the template, their neural pathways pruned and redirected, their psychic capabilities channeled into predetermined forms. They would become, in essence, living receivers tuned to specific frequencies, able to detect and transmit signals that matched those frequencies with perfect clarity while being effectively deaf to all other psychic phenomena. The records described this process in language completely devoid of moral consideration. There was no discussion of consent, no acknowledgement of the profound violation such restructuring represented, no recognition that transforming a human consciousness in this manner might be ethically problematic. The Emperor's notes, and they were clearly his notes, written in an archaic script that predated modern Gothic, but that my team's linguists could still partially translate, described the test subjects as functional or non-functional, stable or unstable, with exactly the same clinical detachment one might use to describe the performance characteristics of machinery. In one notation, dated to approximately 400 years before the official start of the Great Crusade, he wrote, "Template Theta 7 demonstrates promising stability in subjects of medium to high psychic grade. Blinding occurs in 73% of test cases, but does not appear to impact functional capacity. Neural degradation begins after an average of 26.3 years of continuous operation, but this falls within acceptable parameters for planned replacement cycles. Recommend proceeding to mass implementation once political unification is achieved and sufficient test subjects can be acquired." 73%. the exact same statistical constant that appears in the soul-binding records 10,000 years later, 26.3 years. The exact average service life of astropaths across the entire history of the Imperium. These numbers do not represent natural outcomes of divine communion or organic responses to psychic strain. These are design specifications, parameters that were deliberately engineered into the process and have remained constant because the process itself has remained essentially unchanged for 10,000 years. This cannot be coincidence. This cannot be a natural pattern emerging from individual variations in human psychic response. This is the fingerprint of a design system, refined over centuries of experimentation and implemented with ruthless efficiency once the Emperor had the political and psychic power to do so on a galactic scale. Template Theta 7, developed 400 years before the Imperium even existed, is soul-binding. We simply gave it a different name, wrapped it in religious language, and convinced ourselves that it was a blessing rather than psychic engineering. I sealed these data crystals in a containment vault that I rented under a false identity, documented their contents in encrypted personal records, and never spoke of them to anyone. And I continued searching for more fragments, more evidence, more pieces of a puzzle that I was beginning to understand, even though I desperately wished I could unsee what I was seeing. The fourth fragment required me to commit an act that I still cannot fully justify even to myself. I obtained testimony from one of the Emperor's own custodian guard, and I obtained it through means that violated every protocol of respect and deference that normally governs how lower-ranking imperial servants interact with the 10,000. But by this point in my investigation, I had already crossed so many lines that one more seemed almost insignificant. The opportunity presented itself during a period when I was conducting research in the archives beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, ostensibly gathering historical records for an entirely different investigation into a suspected cult operating in the Sol system. I had noticed that one particular custodian seemed to be observing my work with more than casual interest, appearing in corridors where I was working with a frequency that suggested deliberate attention rather than coincidence. After 3 days of this observation, he approached me directly and walked alongside me for exactly 117 paces through a corridor leading away from the main archive chambers. He spoke without preamble, without identifying himself, without explaining how he knew what I was actually investigating or why it concerned him. You seek to understand the Master's design regarding the Astropaths. You examine their creation and conclude that they have been violated, that their faith is built upon false memories, that the soul binding is engineering rather than divine blessing. All of this is true, but you have not yet asked the most important question. I stopped walking, too startled by his directness to maintain the pretense that I was conducting routine archival research. What question? Whether the Emperor considers this a tragedy or simply a necessity. The custodian continued, still walking at the same measured pace. Whether he grieves for what he has done, or whether grief is an emotion he can still feel after all these millennia of existence. I will tell you what I have observed in my 10,000 years of service. At his side, the Emperor does not grieve. He does not regret. He does not second-guess his choices or wonder if there might have been a better way. He simply does what must be done, calculates the costs and benefits with perfect clarity, and expects us to do the same. The Astropaths serve. Their service requires suffering. That suffering is noted, recorded, accounted for in the great calculation of costs and benefits that governs all his decisions. But it does not move him to mercy or compassion, because mercy and compassion are luxuries that humanity cannot afford in the galaxy we inhabit. Remember this when you judge what he has built. It was never meant to be kind. It was only ever meant to work. The custodian had left me standing in that corridor before I could formulate a response, his words echoing in my mind with the weight of absolute authority. Because if he was right, and I had no reason to believe a custodian would lie about something so fundamental to the Emperor's nature, then everything I had uncovered about the soul-binding system was not a perversion of the Emperor's intent, but a perfect expression of it. The violation was not a necessary evil that he regrets, but an acceptable cost that he factored into his calculations from the very beginning. The false memories implanted during soul binding were not a tragic compromise, but a design feature, essential to making the system function. The suffering of the Astropaths was not something that troubled him, but simply data in an equation balancing individual pain against collective survival. The fifth and final fragment that I will present here came from biological evidence that I should never have been able to access. Samples that were obtained through methods that would earn me immediate execution if discovered. A magos biologist of the Adeptus Mechanicus had been conducting unauthorized research into psychic mutation and the cellular changes that occur in psychers during soul binding. This research was tech heresy of the highest order, violating multiple prohibitions against examining the Emperor's sacred workings too closely. When his research was discovered by his superiors in the Mechanicus, he was executed for his transgressions. But before his death, this magos had transmitted his findings to me, perhaps recognizing in my own pattern of investigation a kindred seeker of forbidden truth. He had obtained tissue samples from psychers at various stages of development, before soul binding, immediately after the ritual, and decades into their service as active astropaths. What he discovered through microscopic analysis and advanced bioscanning should be impossible, according to official imperial doctrine about the nature of divine transformation. When a psyker undergoes soul binding, their brain undergoes physical restructuring that is visible and measurable at the neurological level. Specific regions of the brain associated with psychic perception and manipulation show dramatically reduced dendritic density, as if those neural pathways had been deliberately pruned away like unwanted branches on a tree being shaped by a gardener. The reduction is not random or chaotic, but follows precise patterns, targeting specific neural structures while leaving others intact. Meanwhile, other regions show unusual growth patterns, particularly in areas associated with signal reception and transmission. New neural pathways form in configurations that do not occur naturally in human brain development, structures that appear almost artificial in their regularity and precision. The overall effect, according to the Magos's analysis, is a brain that has been hyper-specialized for a single function at the expense of broader psychic capability. An astropath's brain after soul binding is optimized for receiving and transmitting astropathic messages, but shows reduced capacity for every other form of psychic expression: telekinesis, divination, pyromancy, biomancy, all the various psychic disciplines that unrestricted psychers can develop are suppressed or eliminated entirely. It is as if someone had taken a musical instrument capable of producing an infinite range of tones and modified it to play only a single note, but to play that note with perfect clarity and volume. But what made this discovery truly horrifying was the consistency of the pattern. The Magos had examined tissue samples from hundreds of astropaths, drawn from dozens of different worlds, representing a wide range of original psychic grades and abilities. And in every single case, the pattern of neural restructuring was identical, not similar, not roughly equivalent, identical down to the cellular level, as if the same template had been imposed upon every subject regardless of their unique psychic architecture. This is not the fingerprint of divine touch, which one would expect to be unique to each individual soul, reflecting the infinite variation in human consciousness. This is the fingerprint of psychic engineering, repeatable and standardized, a process that can be implemented on any suitable subject with predictable results. The Magos biologist had noted in his final transmission to me, "This is not the mark of God, reaching out to touch his faithful children. This is the mark of an engineer implementing a carefully designed modification protocol. The soul-binding ritual does not commune with the Emperor's consciousness in any meaningful sense. It subjects the psyker to a psychic construct, a template that has been refined over millennia and is projected from the Golden Throne with mechanical consistency. The Emperor may have created this template originally, but he need not be consciously present for each binding any more than a manufacturer needs to personally oversee each individual product that comes off an assembly line. The process has been automated. Automated. The word carries implications that shatter the very foundation of imperial faith. If soul binding is automated, if it is simply the application of a pre-designed psychic template rather than personal communion with the Emperor's divine consciousness, then what does that mean for the millions of psychers who have undergone the ritual, believing they were being personally touched by the master of mankind? What does it mean for their suffering, their sacrifice, their faith that they have been seen and known and blessed by the Emperor himself? When I placed these 5 fragments side by side, the heretical testimony speaking of chains and hollowing, the xenos observation of forced blooming and psychic surgery, the archeotech evidence of pre-imperial experiments with psychic templates, the custodian's frank admission that the Emperor does not grieve for the necessary suffering he causes, and the biological proof of standardized neural restructuring, a single, terrible conclusion emerged with the force of mathematical inevitability. Soul binding is not a blessing. It is not a moment of divine communion. It is not a personal touch from a loving God who sees and cherishes each of his psychically gifted children. It is a psychic procedure, designed and refined over centuries of experimentation, that forcibly restructures a human psyker's consciousness to serve a single, specific function within the Imperium's communication network. The Emperor did not design this process out of malice or cruelty. He designed it out of necessity, out of the pragmatic understanding that humanity needed a galaxy-spanning communication system, and that human psychers in their natural state were too unstable, too vulnerable to chaos, too unpredictable to serve that function reliably. So he created a method to reshape them, to prune away their infinite potential and channel what remained into a narrow but essential purpose. He developed psychic templates that could be imposed upon any suitable psyker with consistent results. He refined the process over centuries until the failure rate was acceptable and the output was reliable. And then, once he had unified Terra and launched the Great Crusade, he implemented this process on a massive scale, creating the Astropathic network that would allow the Imperium to function as a unified civilization rather than a scattered collection of isolated worlds. The evidence suggests, and I frame this carefully, for I am not claiming absolute certainty, but rather presenting the most consistent interpretation of all available data, that every astropath who kneels before the Golden Throne is subjected to a psychic lobotomy of extraordinary sophistication. The blinding is not a side effect of divine radiance, but a deliberate consequence of the neural restructuring, perhaps necessary to sever their connection to visual processing in favor of pure psychic perception. The memory loss, the fragmented recollections, the inability to recall specific details of the soul-binding experience, these are not the result of overwhelming divine contact, but of the psychic editing required to make the template take hold without triggering fatal resistance. The subject must forget what they were before the procedure. They must accept the new identity imposed upon them. They must believe themselves blessed rather than violated, elevated rather than reduced, chosen rather than merely used, because if they understood the truth that they had been diminished, that their vast potential had been sacrificed for a single function, that they had been turned into living tools whose suffering serves purposes they cannot fully comprehend, they would resist, they would refuse, they would choose death over such profound violation of their essential nature. And so the lie became necessary, not as an unfortunate side effect, but as an essential component of the system itself. The psychers must believe they are being blessed. The ritual must feel sacred rather than clinical. The approach to the Golden Throne must be structured to create awe and reverence rather than fear and resistance. All of the ceremony, all of the mysticism, all of the religious language surrounding soul binding exists to ensure that the subject accept what is being done to them without fully understanding what it is. This is why the Astropaths' memories of soul binding are vague and contradictory. This is why they cannot describe the Emperor's face or recall his words or provide any specific details that should be unique to a personal divine encounter. The memories themselves are part of the template, psychic constructs implanted during the restructuring process to provide the subject with a comforting narrative that explains their transformation in terms of blessing rather than violation. Each astropath remembers seeing or hearing or feeling something during soul binding, but no two accounts are identical because the template generates customized memory constructs based on each individual's psychological profile, creating the illusion of personal communion while actually implementing the same standardized modification on every subject. And the Emperor, sitting upon the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, does not personally touch each psyker who kneels before him. How could he? The Astronomicon requires his full attention and the vast majority of his psychic might, maintaining the beacon that guides humanity's ships through the warp. The defense of Terra requires constant vigilance against demonic incursion. The very act of sustaining his broken body requires immense psychic effort. He cannot spare the time or energy to personally conduct hundreds of soul-binding rituals every day across the entire galaxy. Instead, the Golden Throne itself performs the soul binding automatically, projecting the psychic template that he designed millennia ago. The throne is not merely a life support system or a psychic amplifier, but a vastly sophisticated machine that can implement complex psychic procedures without requiring his direct consciousness involvement. When a psyker kneels before the throne in the ritual chamber on Terra, or when they are brought before one of the thousands of relay points across the Imperium where soul binding can be performed remotely through psychic connection to the throne, they are not touched by the Emperor's consciousness, but by a psychic construct that he created long ago and that now operates with mechanical consistency. The Emperor designed the template. He refined it through centuries of experimentation. He embedded it into the Golden Throne's operational matrix, and now it simply runs, processing psychers according to predetermined parameters, producing astropaths with predictable characteristics and acceptable failure rates. He is no more personally present in each individual soul binding than a long-dead architect is present in each brick laid according to their blueprints. This is the necessary lie upon which the entire astropathic network depends. The psychers must believe themselves blessed, for if they knew the truth, that they have been reduced, rather than elevated, violated rather than sanctified, turned into tools rather than transformed into saints they would not willingly serve. They would resist the ritual, flee from the black ships, use their powers to escape imperial control rather than submit to systematic exploitation. And without their willing participation, without the faith that makes them accept the template, without psychic resistance, the whole system would collapse. So the lie is maintained. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica preaches the doctrine of divine blessing. The ecclesiarchy reinforces it with sermons and scripture. The Inquisition hunts down and silences anyone who questions it too deeply or discovers evidence that contradicts it. The entire apparatus of imperial authority works together to preserve the comfortable falsehood, because the alternative, the truth that would shatter faith and make the tools unwilling to be used, is unacceptable. But what of the alternative explanation? What if I am wrong? What if all of this evidence is merely coincidence or misinterpretation, and soul binding truly is divine communion rather than psychic engineering? Let me address this possibility directly, for I have asked myself this question thousands of times over the course of my 40-year investigation. If soul binding is truly divine communion, a personal touch from the Emperor to each individual psyker, then why does it produce such statistically consistent results? Divine interaction with human souls should be infinitely variable, reflecting the unique nature of each individual consciousness and the Emperor's response to that uniqueness. Yet we see the same blinding rate, the same average service life, the same patterns of neural restructuring across millions of subjects over 10,000 years. This level of consistency is characteristic of design systems, not mystical experiences. If the Emperor personally communes with each astropath during soul binding, why can none of them remember specific details of his presence, his words, or his appearance? They should have memories of extraordinary clarity and detail, moments of such profound significance that every aspect would be burned into their consciousness forever. Instead, they have vague impressions, contradictory accounts, memories that become more uncertain the more closely they are examined. This is not how genuine religious experiences manifest. This is how implanted memories degrade over time as the psychic constructs that generate them gradually weaken. If the process is a blessing that unlocks psychic potential, why does biological analysis show neural pruning rather than neural enhancement? Why do astropaths demonstrate reduced psychic capability in all areas except astropathic communication? A genuine divine blessing should elevate the whole person, expanding their abilities rather than constraining them. But what we actually observe is hyperspecialization achieved through systematic reduction of broader capabilities. The comforting alternative that soul binding is exactly what the imperial doctrine claims it to be does not withstand logical scrutiny when confronted with the full weight of evidence I have assembled. I have tried to believe it. I have searched desperately for explanations that would allow me to maintain faith in the official narrative. But every avenue of investigation leads back to the same inescapable conclusion: the astropaths are not blessed. They are engineered, and the blessing they believe they have received is itself part of the engineering, a psychic construct designed to make them accept what has been done to them without understanding its true nature. Now, I must confront the philosophical implications of this revelation. For understanding what has been done is not the same as understanding why it had to be this way or what it means for the nature of the Emperor and his Imperium. The Emperor, in his infinite pragmatism, understood that humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy required tools that ordinary humans could not provide. He needed warriors who could fight for centuries without question or hesitation. So he created the Space Marines, stripping away their childhood, their capacity for normal human relationships, much of what makes humans fully human, to forge living weapons optimized for war. He needed navigators who could perceive the warp and guide ships through its chaos, so he engineered a stable mutation into a specific bloodline, creating an entire caste whose existence is defined by their singular psychic ability and whose genetics are carefully controlled to maintain that ability. And he needed communicators who could span the galaxy, so he designed a process to transform human psychers into living relay stations, sacrificing what they might have become for what the Imperium needed them to be. This is not evil in the conventional sense. The Emperor did not create these systems because he delights in causing suffering or because he enjoys violating human autonomy. He created them because they work, because they provide the Imperium with capabilities essential for survival, because every alternative he could conceive was worse. A galaxy-spanning empire cannot function without faster-than-light communication, and faster-than-light communication in a universe where the warp exists requires psychers, and psychers in their natural state are simply too dangerous and unstable to be reliable. The soul-binding system solves this problem through psychic engineering that transforms unreliable psychers into reliable tools, and it maintains that transformation through a carefully constructed mythology that makes the tools willing participants in their own exploitation. It is brilliant. It is efficient. It works exactly as designed, producing millions of astropaths who serve faithfully because they believe their service is holy. But does understanding the necessity of the system make it less horrifying? Does recognizing the Emperor's pragmatism excuse the violation of billions of individual consciousnesses over 10,000 years? Can we say that the ends justify the means, when the means include systematic psychic lobotomy, implantation of false memories, and the deliberate construction of a lie so profound that its victims spend their entire lives believing themselves blessed when they have actually been diminished? I cannot answer these questions with logic and evidence alone. They are moral questions, philosophical questions, questions that force us to confront what it means to be human in an Imperium that treats individual humans as resources to be optimized rather than persons to be valued. What I can say is this: every time an astropath transmits a message, every time they project their consciousness into the warp and navigate its horrors to deliver information across the void, they are performing an act of extraordinary courage and dedication. The fact that their courage is built upon false memories and their dedication is the result of psychic programming does not diminish the reality of their suffering or the necessity of their service. They hurt, they endure, they sacrifice their sanity and ultimately their lives in service to the Imperium. And they do it because they believe it matters, because they trust that the Emperor values their service, because they have faith that their suffering serves a purpose greater than themselves. That faith is based on a lie, yes, but the service is real, the suffering is real, the necessity is real, and perhaps in a universe as hostile and merciless as ours, we cannot afford the luxury of truth. Perhaps the lie is itself a mercy, protecting the astropaths from the unbearable knowledge of what has actually been done to them, allowing them to find meaning in suffering that would otherwise be too terrible to endure. Perhaps it is kinder to let them believe they are blessed, rather than force them to understand that they are tools, crafted with precision and used until they break. Or perhaps I am merely rationalizing, seeking philosophical comfort because the simple truth is too terrible to accept, without some framework to make it bearable. We have built an empire on the systematic violation of millions of people who never chose their fate and cannot escape it, and we have convinced them to love us for it. There is one final piece of this investigation that I have not yet fully addressed. One area where my research led me into territory so disturbing that I have struggled to articulate it, even in these private records. It concerns what happens to astropaths at the end of their service, when the cumulative damage from decades of warp exposure finally renders them unable to perform their function. The official doctrine speaks of honored retirement, of peaceful contemplation in their final years. The reality is something altogether different. In the deepest sub-levels of every major Astropathic Sanctuary across the Imperium, there exists a chamber that is never mentioned in official records, never visited by anyone except the highest-ranking choir masters, and never acknowledged to exist by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. These chambers are called, in the whispered conversations of those few who know of them, The chambers of echoes. When an astropath reaches the final stages of psychic degradation, when the template imposed during soul binding begins to break down irreparably, when they can no longer perform their function, but have not yet died, they are brought to these chambers. I gained access to one such chamber through means that I will take to my grave, using connections and leverage that required decades to develop. What I witnessed there has haunted every moment of my life since. The chamber was a null field environment, psychically isolated from the warp, from the Astronomicon, from every external psychic influence. And in that isolation, something happens to the failing astropaths that the Adeptus Astra Telepathica has documented with clinical precision, but never explained to anyone outside their highest ranks. The astropaths remember, not all of them. The records suggest approximately 17%, another statistically precise number that appears too consistent to be natural experience, what the Adeptus Astra Telepathica clinically describes as template dissolution with memory reintegration. In simpler terms, when the psychic template imposed during soul binding finally breaks down completely, when the artificial structures in their minds collapse, the original memories and consciousness that were suppressed during the restructuring sometimes resurface. They remember who they were before soul binding. They remember their dreams, their hopes, their sense of potential that extended beyond the narrow function they have been performing for decades. They remember the psychic abilities they once possessed that were pruned away to make them into more efficient relay stations. And most horrifyingly, they remember the soul binding itself, not the comforting false memory of divine communion that sustained them through years of service, but the actual experience of having their consciousness forcibly restructured, their potential truncated, their very nature violated and reshaped according to a template they had no power to resist. I watched as a choir master named Severin, who had served faithfully for 87 years, was brought into the null field chamber. His eyeless face had been serene in acceptance of endless service just hours before, but as the null field cut him off from all external psychic influence, and the template that had shaped his consciousness for nearly 9 decades began to finally dissolve, his expression transformed. Confusion gave way to horror. Horror gave way to a dawning comprehension so terrible that his body began to convulse, even before he started to speak. "I was going to be a sculptor," he said, his voice hoarse from decades of using psychic communication rather than verbal speech. "I remember now. Before they took me, before the black ships came to my forge world, I worked with stone. Terrible sculptures, probably. The kind that apprentices make when they first discover that they can shape matter into something meaningful. But it was mine, my vision, my hands, my soul expressed in form that came from somewhere deep inside me that was uniquely mine. I had a sister. I had a father. I had a name that wasn't a designation. I had dreams that extended beyond the next transmission, beyond the next message, beyond the next psychic relay. I was a person." The attending medica tried to sedate him, recognizing that what was happening posed severe psychological danger, but he pushed them away with a strength that should have been impossible for someone in his physical condition. "I can feel it now. The template. It's still there, still trying to reassert itself, still trying to make me forget again. But it's too damaged, too worn down by decades of use, and I can see it for what it is. It was never the Emperor. It was never his divine touch. It was psychic surgery, performed on a boy who had no choice, who believed he was going to be blessed, and instead was hollowed out and filled with purpose that wasn't his own." He laughed then, a sound so utterly broken that it barely resembled human laughter. "I spent 87 years serving him. 87 years transmitting his messages, maintaining his network, suffering for his Imperium. And I believed with every fiber of my being that he loved me, that he had touched me personally, that my suffering had meaning because he had chosen me for this sacred duty. But he never touched me. He never even saw me. I was processed, optimized, deployed, and now that I'm no longer functional, I'm being discarded. Just another tool that wore out. Severin died 17 minutes later. Not from any physical ailment that the Medica could identify, but simply because his consciousness chose death over continuation with the knowledge of what had been done to him. His heart stopped, his brain ceased activity, and the Medicae recorded cause of death as psychic shock, which is technically accurate, but catastrophically incomplete as a description of what I witnessed. I have seen many horrors in my century and a half of service to the Inquisition. I have witnessed demonic possession, chaos corruption, the transformation of entire populations into mindless servants of the ruinous powers. But I have never seen anything as quietly, profoundly terrible as watching a human being remember their own violation and choose death because living with that memory was unbearable. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica knows this happens. They have known for millennia. They document it, study it, analyze the patterns to determine which astropaths are most likely to experience memory reintegration when the template breaks down. And they use this knowledge not to prevent the suffering or to develop better endings for those who have served so long, but to manage it more efficiently. The chambers of echoes exist as containment protocols, isolating failing astropaths before they can experience template dissolution among their still functional brethren. Because if the functional astropaths learned what awaits them, if they understood that the blessed forgetfulness of soul binding is temporary, and that terrible clarity comes at the end, they might refuse to continue serving. They might choose death over continuation in ignorance. They might rebel, and so the silence is maintained with the same ruthless efficiency that characterizes every aspect of the system. The chambers are hidden. The deaths are attributed to natural causes or psychic exhaustion. The few astropaths who experience memory reintegration are allowed to die in isolation, their final accusations unheard, their terrible understanding contained. The machine continues its operation, grinding up souls and producing service, because to acknowledge what happens in those chambers would threaten the faith that makes the entire system function. This is the ultimate horror. I have uncovered the Emperor's system is so thoroughly designed, so perfectly engineered, that it accounts even for its own failures. The astropaths are used until they break, and when they break in a way that threatens system stability, they are isolated and allowed to die in silence. There is no waste, no inefficiency, no mercy, but also no malice. It is simply the operation of a machine that cannot afford to acknowledge the humanity of its components. What does it mean to worship a being who is also an engineer? What does it mean to pray to an entity who views prayer itself as simply another system to be optimized? The Ecclesiarchy teaches us that the Emperor loves us, that our faith sustains him on the golden throne, that our prayers reach his ears and provide comfort in his eternal vigil. But if the Emperor is what all my evidence suggests, he is a being of vast intelligence and psychic power who has transcended or perhaps never possessed emotions like love or compassion as humans understand them, then our prayers are simply background noise, our faith merely a useful mechanism for ensuring compliance, our love for him utterly unrequited because he is incapable of love in any sense we would recognize. Yet perhaps that judgment is too harsh, too limited by my human perspective and moral categories. Perhaps the Emperor does love humanity, but his love is of a kind so alien to our understanding that it manifests as cold calculation rather than warm affection. A gardener loves their garden, but still prunes the plants, removes diseased growth, sacrifices individual flowers for the health of the whole. The Emperor loves humanity enough to do whatever is necessary for our collective survival, even if that necessity requires actions that seem monstrous when viewed from the perspective of individual human dignity and autonomy. The astropaths are not diseased branches to be removed. They are essential components of infrastructure, as necessary to the Imperium's survival as oxygen is to human life. But they are components, not persons to be cherished. They are optimized, deployed, maintained, and eventually discarded when they fail. And the whole terrible system works precisely because they believe themselves cherished, believe themselves seen and known and valued by the Emperor, when in reality they are simply fulfilling design specifications embedded in a psychic template created 10,000 years ago. I am 183 years old. The juvenat treatments that have extended my life far beyond natural human limits are finally failing. My body succumbing to the accumulated damage of nearly 2 centuries of existence. I have perhaps months remaining, certainly no more than a year. Soon I will face whatever comes after this life, the Emperor's judgment, if such a thing exists, or simply the oblivion that awaits all mortal consciousness when the biological processes that sustain it finally cease. I do not know which I hope for. I do not know if I want there to be an afterlife where I must account for my silence, must explain why I uncovered this truth and chose to keep it secret rather than reveal it. Or if I prefer the mercy of eternal darkness, of consciousness simply ending without judgment or continuation. What I know with certainty is that the Astropaths suffer. Their suffering is real, constant, and profound. It does not matter whether that suffering stems from divine communion or psychic engineering. It does not matter whether they are blessed or violated. They hurt, and they endure that hurt because they believe it serves a purpose greater than themselves. And I have chosen to preserve the lie that makes their suffering bearable, because destroying that lie would cause even greater suffering without changing the fundamental necessity of the system. Every message transmitted across the Imperium, every coordination between distant fleets, every order that allows the Astra Militarum to respond to threats across light years of space, all of it is paid for in the currency of psychic agony. Minds broken and rebuilt and broken again. Souls shaped into tools and used until they shatter. Consciousness itself treated as raw material to be optimized rather than sacred essence to be honored. The Emperor's great working continues, as it must continue, as it will continue until the very end of humanity's reign among the stars. And we call it holy because we must call it holy, because the alternative is to acknowledge that we have built our civilization on systematic exploitation of those who never chose their fate and cannot escape it. I am complicit. Every Inquisitor who has uncovered fragments of this truth and chosen silence is complicit. Every member of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica who maintains the lie is complicit. Every imperial citizen who benefits from astropathic communication without questioning its cost is complicit. We are all participants in a vast deception that has sustained itself for 10,000 years, because the truth would destroy the very foundations of the Imperium. And perhaps that makes us no different from the Emperor himself. Perhaps he too is complicit in a system he can no longer change. Sitting upon the golden throne for 10,000 years, maintaining machinery that he set in motion during the Great Crusade and that now operates beyond his direct control. Perhaps his silence is not divine mystery, but the silence of one who has done terrible things for necessary reasons and must continue doing them, because stopping would doom everything he built. I leave this record not as a call to action for what action could possibly be taken, but as testimony that someone knew, someone understood, someone grasped the full scope of what we have done and continue to do. When you read this, whoever you are, whenever you find it, you will face the same impossible choice I have faced: carry the burden of understanding or seek the comfort of willful ignorance. I chose understanding. I chose to know the truth, even though knowing has poisoned every remaining day of my life. I chose to document what I discovered, even though that documentation serves no practical purpose except to ensure that the truth exists somewhere, preserved in encrypted form, waiting for someone who needs it. The Astropaths scream. In the chambers of echoes, in those final moments before death grants release, they remember what was taken from them, and they scream with the full understanding of what was done. And we do not listen, because listening would require us to acknowledge that every benefit we derive from their service is stained with violation, that every message they transmit carries the psychic echo of souls who never chose this fate. This is the price of empire. This is the cost of survival. This is what it means to endure in the 41st millennium, where hope is a lie we tell ourselves and faith is a tool for maintaining compliance. The recording ends here. The data crystal containing these words will be sealed in a lead-lined box, hidden in the foundations of an unnamed shrine on a world whose location I will not record even in these private notes. If you have found it, if you have decoded it, if you have read to this point, then you understand what I understood. Do with this knowledge what you will. I am beyond caring, beyond judgment, beyond the reach of imperial law or divine retribution. I have seen the machinery stripped bare, and I cannot unsee it. I have grasped the truth, and I cannot unknow it. The Astropaths scream. We do not listen. The Imperium endures. In the name of the Emperor, who may or may not hear this prayer, who may or may not care, who may or may not exist as anything more than the sum of our desperate need to believe in something greater than ourselves, grant them peace. Grant them the dignity they were denied. Grant them the truth they could never know while serving. And grant me, in whatever comes after, the answer to the only question that still matters: was there ever any other way? Or was this violation, this exploitation, this systematic transformation of human souls into tools, was this always the only path to survival? I do not know. I will die not knowing. And perhaps that is the greatest horror of all. Seal date 17, Emben 42. 985 Inquisitor Emeritus Cassian Vex Ordo Hereticus. May the Emperor have mercy on my soul, if souls exist, if mercy exists, if the Emperor exists as anything more than a machine we have convinced ourselves is divine.